Switzerland. It's summertime, and the tourists are enjoying themselves. Most people spend their time down in the valleys, where the towns and cities are. Or perhaps there'll be a little hiking on the lower slopes. But 10,000 feet up, it's a different world. Even in summer, this is rugged and inhospitable country. But it's the ideal time of year to see the one unmistakable feature of these mountains: glaciers. You are looking at a stupendous block of ice. There may be about 15 million tons of it in this one section. There are dozens of them in the Swiss Alps, filling up the high mountain valleys, looking as solid and timeless as the mountains themselves. But as these British scientists are discovering, glaciers are constantly changing. Martin Sharp leads the group.
A glacier is effectively a large river of ice, which derives its nourishment from the snowfall, which accumulates directly on its surface during the winter, and from snow which is transported from the slopes around it in the spring and early summer by avalanches. Now, as that snow accumulates on the surface of the glacier, it compacts under its own weight. It's compressed, and it's gradually transformed into glacier ice.
This is the scientists' second summer on the upper Arola Glacier, not far from the famous ski resort of Zermatt. Here, the glacier is disguised with a thin gray crust of rocks and pebbles, but underneath, it's ice all the way down. Just how deep the scientists are now measuring. They'll use a depth sounder that bounces sound waves off the bedrock underneath the glacier to gauge the ice thickness. The Arola is about 4 miles long, and here at the 2-mile mark, the ice is at its deepest, over 700 feet. The Arola would be a much simpler thing for the research team to study if it weren't for one awkward fact. When summer comes, the ice begins to melt. That's why, although the glacier is moving slowly, it never gets anywhere. In fact, it's gradually disappearing. The surface of the glacier becomes covered with an ever-changing network of little rivulets and rushing streams. And there's another complication. Right down at the lower end of the glacier, where it's completely covered with rock falls, the meltwater ends up in a series of rivers. But the water doesn't flow off the top of the glacier. Somehow it emerges from underneath. How does it get there? That's one question that fascinates the scientists. And it's also something the Swiss people are very interested in, too. This is the reason. It's called the Grand Essence Dam, and it's the highest altitude dam in the world. The lake is 7,000 feet above sea level, and it's made up entirely from glacier meltwater. Project engineer Albert Bézange.
The glacier is like a bank account for Swiss hydroelectricity. Switzerland is the water capital of Europe, and the glaciers are solid water banks which melt and yield interest in the summer. That interest is the water which is collected in the lake.
So much water so high up couldn't be better for generating electricity. It's fed down through pipelines to a series of power stations, which provide a fifth of Switzerland's entire power needs. There's only one problem. The Swiss need most of their power during the winter, when the glaciers are frozen solid. So during the summer melt, they have to concentrate on collecting as much water as possible. And that's where the research team might be able to help. On a typical day, team members are spread out down the glacier. This is Keith Richards.
I'm measuring the discharge of the river so that we can see how it relates to the rate of melting on the glacier. And the water's freezing. Well, almost.
But cold feet are the least of their problems. Martin Sharp.
The water doesn't run off from the glacier as soon as it's actually produced by melting. It has to find its way through the glacier via some sort of drainage system. And that drainage system has to develop through the year. as water is put into it. And so what we're trying to do here is to understand what drainage systems within glaciers look like and how they change through time.
And that's turned out to be a very tricky question because of this. The glacier is covered with holes. A team member is preparing to investigate one of the hundreds of drainage holes that come and go during the season.
How long has this site been open?
It's been open for just over a week.
At a prearranged time, he pours in a batch of red dye. It's biodegradable, so it won't contaminate the stream. Meanwhile, in the valley below the glacier, other team members are setting up to sample the water flowing down. The hose is connected to an instrument that very accurately measures the color of the water. They'll be able to detect any red dye that passes, even though by now it'll be too dilute to be seen by the eye. In this case, it was 2 hours before any dye arrived.
12:44, 4.9.
And it took 20 minutes for that single release to run past. The water had somehow been caught up in the glacier's internal structure and then slowly released. What's going on inside the glacier? Inside, it must look like this. A series of large cavities, probably formed where the ice contacts the uneven bedrock. Connected by small cracks in the ice, the cavities trap the water, slowing down its flow. It sounds simple enough, but this drainage hole, lower down the glacier than the first, is going to produce a completely different result. The dye disappears into the glacier. And at the same point down the valley, the measuring team is in position. But this time, the dye comes past almost immediately.
4:51, 6.3.
It arrives within 10 minutes of release, and it runs past in just 2 minutes. Levels drop back to 0, and then they pick up again for another couple of minutes. The water had drained out rapidly. There must be free-flowing channels, at least 2 different ones to account for the double pulse of dye that appeared. After running hundreds of tests, the team is pretty sure they know what's happening.
What we find at the beginning of a melt season in the spring is that we have a short system of channels at the bottom of the glacier and then a cavity system above that. Now, as the season progresses, the cavity system is gradually converted into a channel system. So we find that the channel system grows progressively up glacier and eliminates the cavity system.
And that's a finding that's not just of interest to the research team as they hike through the mountains. To collect the summer meltwater, Swiss power engineers have built a series of catchments where the glacier runoff drops down through grids like this. The water enters an elaborate network of pipelines and tunnels, 150 miles of them carved into the mountains. Water from 38 different glaciers finds its way through the network into the storage lake behind the dam. Running the system efficiently is a constant headache because the water flows change all the time. So as the team learns more about how glaciers work, the engineer's job should get easier.